This episode is brought to you by Portland Distro. If you like underground music, movies, and more, go to portlanddistro.com for licensed merch, vinyl, CDs, and more. Plug in the discount code 10OFF, TENOFF, for a 10% discount at portlanddistro.com. When you're done with this episode, be sure to head over to our Brothers in Arms. Of course, on Monday, Brandon Legion brings you Horror Wolf 666. On Tuesday, Jackie Smith brings you Into the Necrosphere. And on Thursday, I return with Necromaniac's Horror Podcast. And on Sunday, the gentleman who's accompanying me on this journey into darkness, Karl Haikara, brings you his podcast, Sold Nox. Along Grand Avenue, they've torn the houses down and left emptiness in their place. On one side, a tangle of viaducts, railroad yards, and expressways. A scar of concrete and cinder and iron that divides Black Slum from student ghetto in downtown Knoxville. On the other side, ascending the ridge, shabby relics of Victorian and Edwardian elegance, slowly decaying beneath too many layers of cheap paint and soot and squalor. Most were broken into tawdry apartments, housing for the students at the university that sprawled across the next ridge. Closer to the university, sections had been raised to make rooms for featureless emplacements of asphalt and imitation used brick. Apartments for the wealthier students, but along Grand Avenue, they tore the houses down and left only vacant weed lots in their place. Shouldered by the encroaching kudzu, the sidewalks still ran along one side of Grand Avenue, passing beside the tracks and the decrepit shells of disused warehouses. Across the street, against the foot of the ridge, the long blocks of empty lots rotted beneath a jungle of rampant vine and buried house sites, marked by ragged stumps of blackened timbers and low depressions of tumbled-in cellars. Discarded refrigerators and gutted hulks of television sets, rusted amidst the weeds and omnipresent litter of beer cans and broken bottles. A green pall over the dismal ruin, the relentless tide of kudzu claimed Grand Avenue. So that was the opening paragraphs of Where Summer Ends by Karl Edward Wagner. And I'm here with Karl Haikara of the Soul Nox Podcast, and we're bringing to you Darkness Weaves, episode number 2. How's it going, Karl?
Good. How are you doing, Mike?
Doing all right, man. And yeah, I'm happy that we're getting back into doing this. And for those of you who are just tuning into this, you're saying episode 2. Where was episode 1?
Well, episode 1 was over on Soul Nox. So
that's right, man. So this is a collaboration between Soul Nox and Everything Went Black. And we're going to be alternating episodes. And the first endeavor is to cover the short stories of Karl Edward Wagner that were included in the recently republished In a Lonely Place. And that originally was published in 1981. So we're going to try to get as far as we can through. We're going to try to do all of Wagner's material, but there's quite a bit of it. So starting small, we're just going to hit this first book, going to go through all the short stories one at a time, alternating between Soul Nox and Everything Went Black.
Yep. And Well, you also had your pilot on Everything Went Black, so people can go back and listen to the pilot and listen to the first episode on Soul Knox. And it's been a
Yeah,
little bit.
yeah. The pilot kind of gives you all the biographical information about Karl Edward Wagner. Like that he was born in Knoxville. He passed away in 1994 and was born in 1945. So you can go back and listen to the pilot episode to get all the particulars about Wagner and his publishing career, his editing career, all the various stuff that he's done outside of actually writing. So there you go. You can just go back and check all that stuff out.
Right. Well, and yes, getting into the story too, like that part that you read, like one thing I was struck by is the beginning of the story, much like the last one. You remember how, like, at the beginning of In the Pines, he's talking about like we were talking about how that little prologue almost sets like a mission statement for Wagner's work.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
I feel like that's like brought forward into this book, into the story. I mean, in the sense that we're talking about an environment that's like decayed. You know what I mean? Like, it's got this desolate, deserted, decayed like environment, and it's kind of setting it all up with a similar type of energy as what we got in the last story.
Yeah, that seems to be a recurring theme, especially in these first two entries, these first two short stories. There's this kind of long, lingering view of it gives you a very good idea about what Grand Avenue in Knoxville looks like. And according to our mutual friend, this actually is pretty much what it looks like in Knoxville. Jacob from All Hell, Jacob Kerwin.
Yeah, he said that some areas. I guess I think they've some of the things that Wagner saw. He says in the afterword here that they tore down, but other parts of it were similar. But Jacob did say that they've kind of gentrified a little bit in the past, recent history. So it's not quite as like desolate and kudzu everything as it once was. You know what I mean?
They did something about the kudzu problem in Knoxville.
Well, I guess there's still areas with kudzu, or however it's pronounced, like around. But yeah, they kind of cleaned up some of those neighborhoods, because the downtown's been a little gentrified than it was back then. But I mean, you can still walk down that avenue. I actually went onto Google and was like looking at the avenue and everything's like outside of downtown Knoxville, and kind of given I tried to find some historical pictures. It was kind of hard, but I found some historical pictures of Knoxville in the 70s and stuff, so that kind of give that feeling.
Now, one of the overarching kind of theme in this book, and this might be something that people from the South, particularly this part of the country, the whole kudzu overrun is something I feel like people from that part of the country really resonate with that, because that sort of plant originated in Asia and was brought to this country, so it wasn't an indigenous plant, and it just sort of ran wild. And have you ever seen this stuff in person, Karl?
Yeah, I've seen it in the South, like just covering over like certain areas, or it's just covering everything. Like,
yeah,
some of those pictures, I was looking up the pictures, and you see some of these pictures, and I was thinking like, I had this thought, like, have you ever read the old like William Hope Hodgson stories with like the fungus that like overtakes people and they become like fungus people and stuff like that? You know what I mean?
yeah. That I wasn't gonna use that example exactly, but the idea of strange plants and fungus is like a very common archetype in weird fiction and cosmic horror. You know what I mean? Like some bizarre funguses and growths and things like that. So yeah, I definitely pick up what you're saying on that.
Yeah, like I was almost thinking you could write a weird fiction story about this kudzu, like, because it grows on everything. It grows, like, I read that it grows a foot a day, and
That,
which is crazy. And I was thinking, oh, what if it like overtook your body and you're having kudzu grow out of your flesh or something like that? You know what I mean? Be
Yeah,
kind of
totally,
horrifying.
man. Yeah, that's definitely, it's like a Ben Wheatley kind of. I could see Ben Wheatley making a movie out of something like that, you know.
Right? Like just like I'm sure. I wonder if it would be a good story. I think it might look kind of silly in a movie, but I think you could pull it off. You know what I mean? Like all of a sudden, it's
Well,
like
did you
kudzu's coming out of your
see
body.
that movie Gaia?
Uh-uh.
It's not, it wasn't the best movie, but there was like it kind of dealt with like fungus and mushrooms growing out of people, and the imagery. I think the imagery like that could be kind of cool.
Yeah, I think. I mean, anybody who like obviously here in Colorado, like I guess you could say like mold and fungus and stuff like that aren't really that big a problem, and we don't really have like a lot of really overgrown areas like with something like kudzu or something. But I can imagine being in a more humid environment, like where if you get some mold in there, like it's horrific. Like that mold will take over. Like you're in a basement or something, all of a sudden there's this mold over everything. Like it's a pretty horrifying proposition. You know what I mean? So
So kudzu came to the United States in 1876 as this sort of ornamental flora that some maniac brought over here and just thought it would be okay to. And that's like an age-old issue where people bring something that's not indigenous to the land, and there's like no natural predators, or the environment is such that this particular thing just runs out of control. So that was the case with kudzu, and it's known as the vine that ate the South.
it
Sounds like the name of a story. So
does, yeah. The yeah, I didn't know all this about kudzu until to reading the story. So it's like because he's talking about kudzu, and I'm like, I didn't know what that was off the top of my head, so I had to look online, and then I realized, oh, it's that funky like vine. Also like my friend Ken, who I do my radio station and my shows with, he moved out of South Carolina, and out in South Carolina they also have the English ivy. That's like non-indigenous species that's like will like strangle trees, and like they're like dealing with that in their yard right now. So there's a lot of those kinds of plants that have kind of gotten out of control, like invasive species, and they're like just like killing trees and killing and like native plants and all this kinds of stuff. You know what I mean?
yeah, definitely. So in where summer ends, it's let's run through the characters here and kind of talk about that. So we've got John Mercer, who's a student. Now the interesting thing about Mercer is that he started out studying psychology, which is very similar to Wagner. Wagner actually completed his degree as a psychiatrist before getting into writing. So there might be a little bit of a autobiographical twist to this character. And similar to Wagner, Mercer pivoted to art. He became more into fine art and abandoned his career as a psychologist or psychiatrist. And also notable, he carries a Derringer, a 2-shot Derringer, because he was mugged at one point for protection.
It reminds me of the in From Beyond when the character in From Beyond's like, good thing I carried this revolver ever since I was mugged in East Providence. You know what I mean? I was like, I wonder if that's like a little nod to that. You know?
It could be, man, because so much of these guys, there's so much crossover, between all these different writers, and they all pay homage to each other in different ways. And, there's all sorts of, connections between all this stuff. We have his girlfriend, Linda, who she's kind of like she helps move the plot forward. Like she's not one of the main characters, but she's there to kind of fill in the gaps and keep the narrative going, I think. The other member that I think the story really is between Mercer and Grady, who's this alcoholic ex military vet guy who lives not so much in a junk yard, but in a junk house. Like he inhabits this house that is his own home, yet a collection of all this different stuff, miscellanea that he's accumulated and is selling.
Exactly. And I guess we find out that he used to own like a more like legitimate like type of I guess almost like antique type of store or something like that. Like but then as time went on, when the neighborhood deteriorated, he just kind of, inhabits his space. And he used to work with, I forget what the other guy's name was that
Morning.
disappeared, Morny, that disappeared, and
Yeah.
who had disappeared by the time the story starts. But they had been like tearing down, like kind of going through and like tearing everything out of houses that were condemned, and then just burning them down, basically, like, and getting paid by the city to do it, essentially. So they've been like kind of like they're kind of like I've met people like this, like particularly there's a lot of people like this, like in like I guess areas like that or the South, or I've seen stuff about people like this in Detroit, an area that's kind of run down, where they're kind of like people who live off of like scavenging. Essentially, they're scavenging like valuable or non-valuable items that they can then try to sell, be like junk, like metal, whatever. And
Yeah.
this guy kind of seems to sell to a particular kind of collector, which our main character seems to be, which is a kind of person who likes to buy kind of like junk as like decoration for their house, which I think kind of ties into the kind of 70s. Like, you get the sensation that Mercer and his girlfriend are kind of like real 70s like hipsters in a way, like they're
Absolutely, man.
yeah.
That I was, yeah. Mercer, one of the subplots in this thing, which actually connects him to Grady, is he's trying to buy this mantelpiece for this apartment that he and Linda are renting, which I find, kind of interesting since they're renting it. They don't actually own the place, but they're trying to improve. I mean, I live in an apartment right now. I'm not trying to like, buy things and upgrade my surroundings because I don't own this place, and I just think it's interesting that Mercer has this kind of aesthetic where he wants to improve his surroundings. So he's fixated on getting this mantelpiece from Mercer, from Grady, but it's too much money, like he's kind of living lean. He's not a grad student. He's finishing out his bachelor's degree. Just changed majors. Money's kind of tight. And yeah, they're very much like these kind of 70s. They smoke weed. His girlfriend Linda's into like organic food and everything. They make a note of saying that.
Oh, and then her favorite album is Fleetwood Mac. He mentions that specifically, and I figured out which album it was because at one point in the story, he's talking about how it gets stuck on the needle, gets stuck on the part that says, I think it's like "I Am Afraid" or something like that.
Right.
And that's the last song in their self-titled album. The album, it's called Fleetwood Mac. It's got like Landslide and everything on it.
Interesting. So it's like the post blues Fleetwood Mac. It's like the Stevie Nicks version of the band.
Exactly. Yeah, it's that self-titled album. It's got like Landslide and a few other songs. And I also figured out because of timing, because the story is set in 1976, I think, and that album came out in that year. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
She's also a big Bob Dylan fan too, which Mercer seems to take exception to.
Yeah, he does not like Bob Dylan very much.
I don't blame him, actually. I'm not a big Dylan fan either.
Yeah, I'm not a huge Dylan fan. I liked him a lot when I was a kid, mostly because my dad liked a lot of Dylan. But I suppose as an adult, I've almost never purposely listened to Dylan. You know what I mean?
The thing that I find interesting about Mercer is that the records that he does have are these shadow radio plays.
Yeah, I
like
noticed
the Shadow,
that.
which I thought was awesome. I actually would love to have that stuff on vinyl. That'd be cool to have things like that.
When I was a kid, my dad got me collection of them on tape. It was like this little box set of the Shadow on tape. But of course nowadays, like you could listen to them all on Spotify or whatever, which I've done. I like listening to those old Shadow radio dramas. They're great. And but yeah, it would be cool to have it on vinyl, like a nice like vinyl collection of like some of the best of the episodes. So yeah.
Yeah. Lamont Cranston, right? That's the Shadow. Is that his name?
Yeah, Lamont Cranston. Who knows what lurks in the heart? Yeah, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The
So
Shadow
awesome.
knows.
So, so there's this whole drama going on between Mercer and Grady, and he needs to get this mantelpiece. It's too much money, like all this other, yeah, just kind of like personable stuff. Grady seems to be kind of a recluse. We find out later that he's a vet. It's the kind of guy who like drinks and falls asleep in his clothes and that sort of stuff.
Yeah, he's a World War II vet. We should specify some.
Right, World War II veteran. That plays in because there's some culturally insensitive terminology that gets utilized later on in the story.
Yeah, but it's kind of terminology that somebody who was a World War II vet probably would speak like. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I mean, and that's kind of the thing. It's any guys out there who aren't familiar with this particular genre, like these kind of pulpy writing, it's kind of from a different era, and you also have to not carry in your cultural norms of the new millennium into mid 20th century fiction. There's a lot of insensitive things that are being. I mean, no one listening to this show probably don't need to say that stuff, but it's also I just also feel like it's part of the story. It's painting a picture of a character, and in some ways it's interesting because Linda, her character, is kind of the diametric opposite to the more conservative, regressive attitudes that Grady has. Like she's this like comments about pesticides and how that kills other things besides the pests. And she's into organic food, and like I know it's the second time I mentioned it, but she seems to be this very modern woman, progressive, 70s kind of chick.
Well, one thing that really also highlights that, which is kind of a thing that's mentioned in it that I don't think a lot of people will get, but he talks about, oh, you've been reading that Foxfire book too much. And the thing is, I know exactly what that is because my parents had the whole set of Foxfire books. Like they're like these like series that came out in the 70s and the 80s, I think up until the 80s, that was all about like natural living and like living off the land, and like it's kind of real like it was like a mixture of stuff, like because they'd have like kind of old time like solutions, to living off the land and living, more old fashioned ways of living like that. Like those were popular for like a lot of the hippies who wanted to go live in the mountains and stuff. Like, because my I guess like in a way, 'cause my parents kind of did that because they went up and lived in the mountains in a house of no electricity and running water and stuff. You know what I mean?
Wow,
Like,
I didn't know that.
yeah, we lived like that for a little bit once a kid. So. Yeah, so they had all these Foxfire books, like so. I mean, I know what those are. Like I've read some of them when I was a kid, so I noticed that and I was like, that's a real '70s mention that not everybody's probably gonna get reading the story. You know what I mean?
That slipped right by me. I had no idea about that.
Yeah, because she's all talking about, oh, we should go live in the mountains and up in a cabin somewhere, and he's all like, oh, you're us reading too much of a Foxfire book, and I was like, oh, that's funny. Like I haven't thought about that book in a long time.
You know what? That's a very interesting thing. And I think it speaks to Karl Edward Wagner himself, like the guy. I feel like Mercer is kind of like I feel like is like a cipher for him. And Mercer is like, and I'm going to say that as an analog for Karl Edward Wagner because I don't know a whole lot about him, but I've seen that documentary, The Last Wolf, and I've read about him and all that sort of stuff. And he's like one of those guys who kind of sat like right in the middle of what I think a lot of the stuff that was going on in the 70s. He probably identified with like regular people, like your kind of average guy, but he also identified with these kind of like progressive people, but like wasn't too far in either direction. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I know you're trying to say it all exactly. Like it was kind of like that kind of viewpoint. That was kind of how my dad was. It was kind of like in that middle point where he liked a lot of that kind of like progressive, like hippie type stuff, but he also kind of didn't. He was like still like rooted in, like he liked the Shadow and stuff like that. He was like rooted in like this kind of older stuff as well. So it's kind of like in this kind of weird middle point, and I could see that with Wagner a lot.
Yeah. So we made reference to Grady's partner Morny, and at the time of the story, he's already been found dead, lacerated, and like cut up really badly.
Yeah, like
And
where they've like skinned him essentially, like with so
Yeah.
many. Yeah.
And Grady makes a statement about that. He's like, you cut a man if you're just fighting. You stab a man if you want him dead. So, I
Yeah.
mean, bringing some of his like combat, vernacular into the whole thing.
Yeah. The and they say that they found him like I think in the kudzu or something like that, right? Like so
Yeah.
it's yeah. And
Yeah.
the the kudzu, there's also a point in the story where the girlfriend like Linda, right? That's
Linda. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. There she's like posing for Mercer, and then she feels like something's watching her, but he looks out and it's just like the kudzu,
Right.
but that's like a little nod of what ends up happening. So
Yeah. It's kind of foreshadowing,
yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, the story itself, like the actual story beat for beat is like pretty simple, really. It's more just the atmosphere and the sense of anxiety that sort of permeates this whole thing.
Yeah, and I really liked the environment because it is this rundown, like, very like depressed like area. Like it's a downtown area that's been like basically abandoned, and I mean like where Grady lives, for example, is like, he's the only person who lives there. It's like he's like living in this like abandoned, building and like with just lots with like torn down houses and stuff around him with like, just this kudzu taking over everything. You know what I mean? So it's like this really desolate, definitely kind of dangerous environment. Like it makes you, you know, it's it's kind of like a similar type of environment that you can imagine, parts of Detroit or all these kinds of things. And I think those kind of environments really work well for this kinds of uncanny stories. Like, like if you read like some of the Ligotti stuff set in Detroit and everything, like you kind of get that same type of feeling here.
Yeah, actually, it's old school Detroit. I mean, Detroit's a little bit different. It seems to be improving. Like I guess I haven't been there in a few years, but yeah, one time I remember I was in Detroit and we played a show and we plugged in the hotel address into Waze, which is gives you the directions like in a straight line to where you're going. Doesn't really give you probably maybe not the directions that you would prefer to have, that were like on major roads.
Right.
No, it took us through like this area that had no street lights, and there was like you can see where the roots were like growing up through the street and everything, and it was just like abandoned and just desolate. And that's what I imagine Grady's place is, in an area like that, where maybe half of the street lights have been like knocked down, and it's dark at night and that kind of thing.
Exactly. It gives you a real eerie feeling, and then there's this eerie feeling from the encroachment of the kudzu, which almost seems to be purposefully growing. You know what I mean? And basically, we started out, we were like given like the kind of information about like Mercer's trying to like liquor up Grady, like, and everything, he's trying to figure out his best strategy for getting the mantelpiece for cheap. And then he leaves and we're introduced to Linda, and then they go together to Grady's, and that's when Linda tries to go into the um
It was like a shed.
goes in a shed and sees like things that almost look like rats but have like monkeys' hands. That's how she describes it. And Grady goes in and like blasts them and stuff.
Well, immediately I thought of Brown Jenkin or something like that. Like some kind of like Brown Jenkin-esque like creature,
Yeah. Yeah, I was like, okay. I don't when I first read, I was like, I don't know. I really didn't know where the story was going the first time I read it at all. I'll be honest, like and like one thing that he mentions is that there's like some type of Grady has like a display case and he has like a skull in there that they call a Jap general skull, but it's like obviously like some type of weird like monkey skull or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's like the kind of stuff you would see out in like Coney Island and stuff like that. You know what I mean? Like, honestly, even today, like you would find weird curios like that. But definitely throughout the 80s and the 90s, if you go out in Coney Island, you'd see some weird, guys selling these like curios, that were allegedly recovered like in ancient Egypt or something, but it's like, like a dog skull or something like that, or a monkey's head, or a hand or something like that, and it's like, but yeah, that's kind of the vibe that that Grady had with these skulls. There's actually, it turned out that I guess there's 3 of these skulls as it's revealed, but they're none of the skulls are actually none of the things that Grady claims them to be, as we discover.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, basically we're introduced to that. Then Mercer ends up stumbling on Grady had a dog, and he says, "Oh, he ran off." But Mercer ends up like kind of stumbling into Kudzu and sees the dog like flayed. You know what I mean? Like just like snap up corpse, and he doesn't say anything to anybody because he doesn't want to upset Linda or whatever.
Sheriff the dog.
Sheriff the dog, yeah. So you're like, oh fuck, like, okay, that's not good, And they go back and to their apartment and everything, and then Grady calls up Mercer and is like, hey, like you want that mantle, right? Like if you give me some money, like cash, like now, like I'm gonna sell it to you. He's like, I'm selling out, I'm getting out of here, like basically. And I want to make sure you get that because I know you wanted it, So the of course, like Mercer's like, yeah, I want that. So he like managed to scrape up some money and go down to Grady's and to get the mantelpiece or whatever, right?
Yeah, which I always thought that was kind of funny because it's like these motherfuckers like have no money at all. They can't eat yet. They're scraping together money to go and pick up this like mantelpiece to put in their rented apartment, which that whole scenario just strikes me as like really funny. And also kind of like something that I might have done like at one point when I was like 22 years old or something, It's like, oh yeah, man, I got to get like this piece here to put in this rented apartment.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I definitely probably bought some stupid shit when I was in my 20s like that, where you're like, I probably shouldn't have gotten that. Like, I didn't really need to spend that money right now, but
yeah,
that's part of what happens in your 20s. I think it's funny too because it's the middle of the night too. It's not even like, I mean, it's like Grady calls them like 12 at night. You know what I mean? You're like, okay, like, and why is he so in a hurry to get the fuck out of there too? Like that's like another thing.
So he and Linda go back over to Grady's place, and they do the deal. And Grady loans them his truck to transport the mantle back to their place. All right, so they go and they do that, and they're going to go back and return the truck to Grady. So that's when they bring it back. That's when they discover all this stuff. There's like another head with like the remains of flesh on it. There's like a pot boiling. Something inside the pot is boiling, and it's overboiling because they can't find Grady. So she looks in there. It's like, oh my God, he's eating rats, right? But it turns out that it's not a rat. It's that skull, the head, the defleshed head of some kind of creature. And that's when we discover like really what lurks inside the kudzu. And Grady's in his room. He's all mutilated, beat up, and on his last legs, and he kind of tells them like what's actually lurking out there.
Yeah, he says like the Japanese like warned him like in when he was in occupation in Japan that there's like some type of creature that lives in the kudzu that like kind of lives like as like in the roots or something like this, I guess. Like like they use the kudzu to kind of like protect themselves. They encourage it to grow. They kind of direct its growth, all this kinds of stuff. And then during winter, when it gets cold, they like dig underground and they like burrow underground. And somehow these creatures came over with the kudzu when it came to the United States, and so they're there. They don't want people to know about them. And as soon as people like seem to figure out anything about them, they take care of them. You know what I mean? So.
Yeah, so Grady was kind of at war with these creatures, because they figured out. He also indicated that they were intelligent. They weren't just like these animals. They actually had intelligence, and they were scheming, and they knew that he knew about them and what their their plans were and their activities. So they were scheming against him to get rid of him, and that was kind of the whole deal. It was like he was kind of at war with them, and that night is when they made their move against him.
Exactly. So he kind of knew, and that makes sense. He seemed like pretty nervous when they saw him earlier in the day, right? So it's almost like he kind of could see that the kudzu is growing closer and closer and closer to his house. Like they're gonna try to like take him over or whatever, take him out. So that's why he's gonna try to get out of there. But they struck too fast and they stabbed him, you know, and then he dies like on the bed or whatever. And they try to leave, and I think the part at the end when he's describing how they try to get out and they realize that the tires have all been put out on the truck and everything is just like it's terrifying. You know what I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely. And then the final line in the story is there's like 100 of these assailants, and he only has 2 shots in his little puny derringer that he carries on his hip, which I thought in some ways is like darkly humorous, but in the same sense it's also kind of terrifying knowing that you don't have a fighting chance at all.
Yeah, like it's like the final like lines of it are just like I don't know. It's just like they really stick with you because it's like, um, where is it? He just says, "That's right. All about them. The kudzu erupted from 100 hidden layers. Mercer fired twice. That's it. You know, it's like
Yeah.
that's how it ends. It's like just like kind of horrifying. It's very horrifying, to be honest.
Yeah, and just 2 shots, that's it. And there's like, all these like creatures like trying to attack him and stuff.
It's like you know that they're done, and you kind of feel bad because Mercer is not a bad guy. He's kind of a little goofy, like trying to buy this mantelpiece and stuff. You know what I mean? But he's not. He seems like a nice enough guy, and Linda's a nice girl. Like you feel bad that they're getting taken out by these like fucking little kudzu devils. You know what I mean?
Yeah. A little fun fact about these like kudzu monkeys is they're actually based on a southern cryptid. There's like some sort of I guess they call them skunk apes. So it's like a southern, like a Bigfoot or like a chupacabra or something like that.
Right. Yeah, I've heard of the skunk apes. Although a lot of times people seem to use that interchangeably with like Sasquatch, like a southern Sasquatch. You know what I mean? Like they're big, but I have heard of some people describing them as these smaller beings as well. I mean, the South has a lot of like different like cryptids.
Yeah.
Like
One of the things, like the more I think about this story is like how all right, were these little green creature guys. I still am trying to figure out how the hell they came over here with the plants. You know what I mean?
I don't know either. Yeah, that was kind of I was kind of confused about that too. Like they brought the plants over. It's weird. It's almost like you get the sense that that maybe they're actually um like grown out of the plant itself. You know what I mean? Like they're
Yeah.
like plant flesh or something. I don't know. It doesn't. I'm not 100% sure if how they could have came over.
That's the only conclusion I can come up with too, is that they're actually plants, like they're vegetable people or something, which wouldn't be out of the realm of possibility with like the logic that they're exhibited in these types of stories.
Yeah, that was like my big question at the end of the story as well. Was like, okay, how did they get over here? It would be, I guess, a little bit different if they were maybe like some type of native species that's using the kudzu, but it seems like it's implied that they're from the kudzu, like that. So it's almost like I get the sensation that they're almost like yeah, these like kudzu devils, like like they're like grown out of the kudzu. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so interesting. Yeah.
It's, it's
So
yeah, I'm not sure.
impressions. What are your impressions of this story?
I think overall of the story, I really like the atmosphere of it. Like the in the environment, the like what's the word? The setting I think is really compelling. Like this kind
Yeah.
of desolate, like rundown like area of Knoxville with the kudzu like overtaking everything. And it has a lot going for it. It's definitely a very like doesn't waste a lot of time. It does a really good job of building characterization. Like you get to know these characters like very easily and very quickly, and like they seem like people that we've met. They seem like people that I know. Like in a lot of ways, like or I've known. So you can kind of relate to the people in the story. So I think which adds to the kind of horrific nature of the story because like you feel bad for these people like that they've kind of stumbled into this situation, and they're paying the ultimate price because they're not making it out alive.
Oh no, it's clear that they're not making it out. And even Grady is not, he's like a sympathetic character as well. Because like you think of a guy who, you know, survived World War II, you know, he comes back home and then there's just like his life just declines, you know what I mean? Along with the town that he lives in. And then there's this like encroaching wave of bizarre plant life. And then these creatures that seem to be inhabiting the plant life. And ultimately his end is pretty brutal.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, he's definitely a very sympathetic character, and he doesn't, he's just like one of those guys who's like selling junk out of his house, kind of making ends meet. You know what I mean? Like he's not really like he's not a bad guy or anything. So it's like, yeah, maybe he's kind of like a alcoholic, like a little bit low life kind of guy, but he's not like a scumbag or something. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
he's just
Yeah.
like just a guy, and so it's you definitely have like sympathy for all the characters in it.
One of the things too that in the Pines they also talk about desolation and decline and things like that, and how a place that had former glory and the state that it's in after like years of neglect, and that definitely carries over into this story as well. But the other thing that plays into this story is there's this sense of like things in ruin being reclaimed by like nature, or like somehow there's like this eternal presence that's reclaiming anything that might have been built or by man. Like there's this city that's crumbling, and then there's this plant life that's overtaking everything. And the plant life, though it's not indigenous to that area, is natural. It's like part of the natural world, and it's enveloping these constructs that man has created.
Yeah, that's definitely a big theme in the story, I think, and I mean, and that completely envelops. I mean, if you look at pictures of the kudzu, it like fucking completely envelops like places. You know what I mean? Like nothing. You all you see is fucking leaves. So it's like, yeah, nature is like reclaiming this land, and as soon as people kind of like leave it and um let it go into ruin, and it does have that feeling of past glory. I think that, and I don't, I'm kind of going through Wagner as we're going through it ourselves, so I don't know if it's like recurring themes yet with a lot of his work, but I don't know if like this, if he like will be returning even more to this kind of desolation theme. But I mean, I know that in some of the Kane stories I've heard like being read on the internet, they deal with some of the same things with old desolate like civilizations and stuff. So maybe it's kind of a theme that he likes to return to.
Yeah, actually, there's a specific Kane story that comes to mind that I can't remember the title of it, because I've just been blasting through like story after story in the last few months. But there's one where Kane, who's he's an immortal, so he's been alive for thousands of years, and he comes to the ruins of this city, and he has memories of the city being like a energetic, like vibrant place, and he was just has this like brooding, like kind of like feeling while he's standing in the ruins of the city.
Right. Yeah, I think think one of the stories I read, he was like with like this like giant. Did you read? Have you read that one?
That's the one, I think. Yeah. The
Yeah,
giant, and then they go and they he has to get the crown from like this inside this cave.
yeah, that's the one. Yep,
Yeah.
I listened to a reading of that, and yeah, they get out of the cave, and he's talking about how what it was like when it was in existence. So yeah, I read
Right.
that,
When the
and
giants were like a like the dominant like civilization on the planet, you know.
yeah, exactly. And I think that I mean it's a kind of a common theme with like I mean Howard talked about a lot of these types of ideas as well of like the rise and fall of civilizations and nature reclaiming and the fall into barbarism and back again and everything. And I think definitely Wagner is probably following in those. I think in some ways he's expanding upon that in the horror context more than Howard did, because I mean Howard did touch upon that with like say the Black Stone, but in his horror stories, there's not a lot of that in his horror stories necessarily. In the same way that you see with Wagner.
Yeah, definitely. Well, next up, we got probably one of my favorite Karl Edward Wagner stories, Styx. I think that's the next one in the book.
It is, yeah. Styx is the next one. So, and that was one of the few that I had known before. Getting the A Lonely Place book. So, but it's gonna be good to go back and reread it and get ready for that one because I mean that one's a pretty important story. So, in the
Oh yeah, yeah,
canon of
definitely.
Wagner.
Yeah, a lot of it's the thing about it too. It's the way that it impacts media in like the last like 20 or 30 years. Like that story, I feel like is the first time I watched Blair Witch Project or something like that was right around the same time that I'd actually discovered this story. And it was like, and also the artist, what the hell's his name? Coyle. Uh, damn. Anyway, with the lattice and all that sort of stuff, it all ties in nicely with those like things made out of branches and sticks that show up in the Blair Witch Project. And then later, of course, you know, we have True Detective. And I think all that stuff is connected back to this story Sticks that we're going to cover next time.
Yeah, I'd be curious to see if the guy who did the production design for Blair Witch Project, because Brandon had him on the pod on Werewolf 666 like back a while back. He had that guy,
Oh, I
and
gotta find that episode.
yeah, but he didn't say anything. I don't. He didn't say anything about being inspired by Wagner. So probably it might just be a coincidence, but you never know. I mean,
Well, the
yeah,
one thing I can say is that maybe not the production designer, but Nick Pizzolatto, the guy who created True Detective, he cites Wagner, of course, Chambers and Lovecraft as like inspirations for the story. So I
right.
mean, I'm sure that he had notes and direction that he gave to the production designer about stuff that he wanted to have in the movie. Like he probably has like in the script, there's some notes about what these things look like.
Yeah, with True Detective, you have a solid link, between season one and Karl Edward Wagner, which is I was actually surprised that like with when that season came out, you had a kind of rise in. I mean, say King of Yellow, for example, went from being a book that was almost literally impossible to find to being something you can get a million different versions of it
Yeah.
now. Like I mean, like I remember trying to find King in Yellow 20 years ago and like not being able to find it even in the library. You know what I mean? And now like it's like you have your choice of like 20, 30 different editions and all these different styles and stuff for that, and I think season one also is part of the reason why we got the Penguin edition of Legati. Like it had like this ramification for a lot of other writers, but I'm surprised that it didn't have the same one for Wagner when Wagner was probably a bigger influence on True Detective than even, you know, King in Yellow and stuff. You know what I mean? Really. So it's kind of funny. What maybe now if In a Lonely Place being out, he'll start to get his just desserts.
I hope so, and I mean, even just the southern setting of it too. Like, a lot of Wagner's like his horror stories, particularly, take place in like the mid South. And of course, True Detective takes place in Louisiana, but there's like that southern vibe to everything in Wagner's stories. And particularly this one takes place in Knoxville. The In the Pines takes place in Tennessee, I believe, or I mean in Missouri, possibly, if I remember correctly.
I think it's Tennessee. Yeah.
Tennessee or Missouri, one of somewhere in that region, the mountains.
Yeah,
But
I think it's
yeah,
Tennessee because it's in the Appalachians. So
yeah. And then the just the vibe and the sort of description of these kind of desolate towns. I mean, even in True Detective, when Russ Cole is like, this looks like the memory of a town. That's like one of the most Wagnerian parts of the this. He's like talking about they go to the town and he's like this is like a memory of a town that's like slowly fading, and it's like such in line with all the stuff that we've been reading in these two short stories about how all these like structures and constructs of mankind are fading memories.
yeah, and I with this story also, I think we should probably mention Manly Wade Wellman because again, as Wagner was, I think he was even in contact with Wellman and was a popularizer of Wellman's writings, and Wellman was exactly that, like a weird fiction author who set his stories in the South, in the Appalachians, and so I could almost see a Wellman influence in this with like the Little Monsters. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah.
I don't know Wellman that well, but I know that his work was like super important for people like Wagner.
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with his work, honestly, either. I just, there's like been a couple of collections here and there that I picked up. He's someone that I definitely want to get deeper into, though, for sure.
Yeah, I never really. I guess because I don't know. I just never really gone deeper. Like and then I have like the Hellboy Crooked Man like two shot that he did inspired by Wellman, and I've heard like HP Podcraft covered Wellman some,
Yeah.
so so I kind of have an idea of how Wellman's stories go, but he does often encounter these kind of weird creatures like that. But it's a totally different. The one thing about Wellman and Wagner that's totally different is the ultimate feeling. Like there's a kind of, I don't know, Wellman's stories. He goes and Silver Dawn goes and encounters this stuff, and then he defeats it, and he keeps moving on. You know what I mean? With Wagner stuff, there's more of a dark, brooding, like pessimism going throughout. I mean, like this is a pretty pessimistic story. Like our main characters are fucking, you know, dog meat at the end. You know what I mean? Like, and
Yeah.
like it's definitely not like fun.
Well, we're two for two right now. It's so far with these short stories where the main character doesn't make it out alive. So
Yeah, exactly. So it's like I feel like that's definitely um and something kind of running thing with Wagner is a little bit more of a brooding kind of darkness throughout his work,
and at the same time, he injects a little bit of humor in there too. Like there's like it's interesting because in one hand it is very dark, it's very brooding, but then there are these lighter moments, like his Mercer's interaction with Linda is very light, you know, and her character is pretty light, it's a contrast. And I guess through that, when the evil stuff happens to them, it's even more impactful, I guess.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, he's positioning them as just pretty like normal people, like they're like interacting and kind of joking with each other and whatever, and it's like, listening to Fleetwood Mac, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. He's like,
but
making a charcoal drawing of her naked, like that kind of stuff.
yeah, that's like a plot point, and then it comes up a couple times where he's like trying to like
Yeah.
draw her.
That's like a very 70s thing too. It's like, sketching like naked women and stuff,
Yeah, it's like I'm gonna sketch my girlfriend naked, basically.
All right, man. So that's episode 2, man. We got that one done, and the next one I'm really looking forward to, man. That's going to be an epic story, I believe, to cover.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, like, I really like the story. I think I liked In the Pines even better because it had a bit more of like an emotional impact. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, there's something a little bit heavier. I did like the story a lot, but I'm really looking forward to hitting Styx. It's also a longer story as well, so
Yeah.
it'll be a little bit more in depth to cover.
Yeah, In the Pines had real heavy emotional context. It's like, I have to imagine that Wagner got very personal with like some of his characterizations, and yeah, it's hard to say, but this like all the relationship stuff that was going on in the Pines, and yeah, just like there's a lot of layers to that story. This one, pretty straightforward, but very, the atmosphere was right,
Yeah. One thing I was gonna say earlier that I forgot was when you're saying that Mercer might have been kind of like a little bit of a cipher for Wagner himself. When he is described in the story, it almost kind of sounds like probably what Wagner looked like when he's younger. He's kind of like not like super muscle, but he's like a bigger guy. Like, you know what I mean? Like kind of the way he describes him, the character almost seems like he's describing himself. You know what I mean?
Yeah, he's not fat, but he's like stocky, I guess, or like one of these kind of stockier dudes,
Yeah. So yeah, I think he definitely inserts himself a lot into these stories. Probably, I would imagine Wagner himself liked listening to like The Shadow. You know what I mean? Like he probably put that in, like just kind of like how in the previous story he had the guy reading like weird tales. So.
Yeah, that's true. That's right. In the last one, and he was like kind of denigrating. That was like that was the humor in that story. Was he was talking about how this is like, I can't believe people read this stuff,
Yeah, it was like
in the Pines.
Yeah, he's kind of talking about people who are incredulous or whatever.
All right, man. Well, thanks for listening, guys. And the next episode will be on Soul Nox on Karl's show. So we'll catch you guys next time.
Yep, and got us down for I think the second last week of next month. So
yeah, all right, man. We'll do it.
Cool.
Often seems to be clearest at the stream. Dragged from the ocean, and given eyes, called from the wind as if we were wise. Still now you voices, let us rest.